This morning, choosing his battles and relishing the art of the fight.
If I want him out, he'll be out of there real fast.
Donald Trump takes on the Fed, the courts, and any institution that doesn't fall in line. The strategy behind the showdowns. Plus, the court rips into Trump's handling of deportations and due process and issues a dire warning as the immigration PR wars escalate. Also, RFK Jr. contradicting his own agency and sparking backlash.
I'll never play baseball. I'll never write a poem.
For bogus claims about autism. And all aboard Trump Station? The president adding one of the world's biggest transit hubs to his list of renos. Here in studio, Malik Abdul, Alyssa Farah-Griffin, Harry Enton, and Jemele Hill. It's the weekend. Join the conversation at the table for 5. Good morning, I'm Abby Phillip in New York. This is a president who promised a fight, and he's delivering multiple main card matchups. In the first 90 days in office, the Trump White House has gone toe-to-toe with DEI, tariffs, law firms. He's tearing through the Department of Education and everything from early start programs to the Ivy Leagues. Judges and the court system are fueling his ire. Greenland, Canada, the Panama Canal, South Africa, and the United Nations. The media, red dye number 3, fluoride, USAID, the Kennedy Center, former officials from the Biden administration, officials from his own first term, AutoPen, military base names, pennies, pronouns, FEMA, flags, water pressure, national parks, paper straws, research programs, vaccines, President Zelensky, U.S. agency buildings, Governor Hochul, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, food safety inspections. That's just to name a few. And it is a list that is getting longer every day. And his base cannot wait for the next round. But what does it tell us about this presidency? Alyssa, he is taking on every fight under the book. And I can only imagine it's because he believes there are no consequences. And he might be right. But I think there are a lot of people who are worried. I mean, Karl Rove earlier this week said there's too much retaliation. He's distracting actually from his wins by fighting so much.
Donald Trump spent 4 years out of office basically fuming over losing the 2020 election and thinking and dreaming up what he would do when back in office. And he actually came up with an agenda. Some of it is Project 2025. Some of it is just simply things that he's tweeted about and talked about over the years. And he is doing it. He has staffed himself with loyalists who were told these are your specific things that within the agencies you work in, you're supposed to be doing. And he's not going to break this pace that he's working at, by the way. So we're almost 100 days in. Expect even more for the next 4 years ahead. And there's an element of retaliation for sure, which I do not think plays well even with those who elected him. But some of this is truly what he thinks his base wants to see in the government, whether it's what he's doing at HHS with RFK and with some of these sweeping changes, or even within the Department of Education. Some of it is aligned with what he ran on, campaigned on, and there's an element of the Republican Party is with him. But there is part of it that is pure Donald Trump vengeance, and that's where he gets himself in trouble.
You said we are not even 100 days in. I thought we were like 500 days in at this particular point. It's just,
every day is like dog years.
Every day. I feel like a little Shih Tzu. Look, you Google, you look at Google Trends, more people are searching Trump chaos than certainly at this point in April of 2017. We're even higher for chaos in terms of searches than we were during the first term, at least on average. And, you just think of it more than that. You look at the number of executive orders he signed. It's not just a record for dating back since like 1951 was as far back as I initially looked in terms of this point through a presidency. There are more executive orders that have been signed during the first less than 100 days than any president that I could find on record. There just is so much that's going on. And sometimes, even as someone who follows this, it's like, okay, where's the bouncing ball going to end up next?
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the first Trump term, one of the things that you would always kind of hear, especially from voters, was like, I am just so sick of hearing about Trump. I am sick of hearing about what is happening in Washington. There are a lot of people in this country who are like, make my life better and stop making me think about you every day. And Trump is definitely making people think about him every day. That is what he loves to do.
One thing that I noticed when you were reading that list is like none of it had to do with making people's lives better on a day-to-day basis. He's picking fights And he's showing his pettiness all the time to the point where we're just like, all right, guy, we get it. You lost the last election and now you're using this very powerful platform to get off all your grievances. And it's like, that's not what you were elected for. You can do things to pay to your base, but you run the whole country. You don't just run your base. And so I think most people are feeling wildly uncomfortable with what they're seeing financially. We know that confidence in how he's leading to the economy has plummeted. That's the main issue that everybody said that they voted for, or rather voted against, in terms of not wanting Kamala Harris's agenda. So if the economy was number one on your priority list, what does the Kennedy Center, what does DEI, what does that all have to do with the economy? Literally nothing. Yeah. So to me, it's just a complete exercise in utter foolishness and chaos that leaves people feeling much more broken than it leaves us feeling unified. He hasn't done a lot to actually bring us together.
I don't think
everything,
he's
and he does.
I don't think that was on the
that's
agenda
a
this time around.
Like, that is a problem, that he's not doing anything that makes us feel like, you know what, even though I didn't vote for him, all right, I'm good with it.
I mean,
Nothing.
I will never get over, I had Dr. Ben Carson on the show, and he looked me plain in my face and said, no, there's no retribution. Trump is not going to, that is what these first 100 days have been about. Yes.
I was sitting by you, we're like, huh.
Ben Carson said it. The senator from South Carolina said it. I mean, it's retribution, and proudly so. Proudly so.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people felt that it wasn't going to be an element of that. And for normally presidents have one thing that they're able to do in their first year, because we go into the midterms, you're not going to get anything done then. For Barack Obama, it was Obamacare, or the health care. For Donald Trump in his first term, it was, in those first years, it was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Donald Trump, this time around, and I do agree with Alyssa, Donald Trump, it really is a lot of unfinished business. He felt as if he was not allowed to have a second term, and Donald Trump is doing not just a lot of things continuing what he did in the first term, it is those things that he always wanted to do, that many people in the Republican Party always wanted to do, and I don't think that the pace is going to lessen in any way. Donald Trump is going to keep barreling forward, and I think the important thing for him is that he wants to get as much done in as little time possible. Even though it doesn't typically work that way, Donald Trump is going to keep this pace.
So notice the word that you said is he and Republican Party. You didn't say us.
I did.
You didn't say all of us. So it's like, your number one job as an elected official, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, is to serve the people and to listen to your constituents. He is doing neither. So that means it's a failure.
Well, it's not a failure yet. Donald Trump, Donald Trump is not going to bring us together. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. That's just not going to happen with Donald Trump. But I do think that a number of the things that the administration is doing, and we're going to talk about some of those things, Donald Trump is moving forward really at record speed on a lot of these
I just want to raise this because I think this came as a surprise to a lot of people. I think there's a lot of alarm about what's happening now, and that it's not just chaos for the sake of chaos. It's chaos designed to break down institutions, from the judiciary to independent educational institutions to using the IRS to go after people. David Brooks wrote an op-ed on Thursday evening that said, "What's happening is not normal. America needs an uprising that is not normal." He says, "These are not separate battles. This is a single effort to undo the parts of the civilizational order that might restrain Trump's acquisition of power, and it will take a concerted response to beat it back." Do you ever, Alyssa, have any fear that David Brooks is right, that Trump is trying to break down any inhibition to him doing any and everything that he wants?
I called it on Inauguration Day, it was a shock and awe campaign. And that's a military term, basically meaning you overwhelm your enemy or your perceived adversary so they don't even want to fight back. And that's what this is. It is flooding the zone. The fact that he came out with an executive order saying that he was going to target two of his former officials, Miles Taylor and Chris Krebs, with the Department of Justice, and it was basically not even a full day story. It's basically kind of forgotten in the headlines to former colleagues of mine and people who simply did their jobs. That that just goes to show when you throw so much out there, there is a limited appetite in the media and in the public opinion to even kind of permeate in looking into how much these things actually matter. That's one small example of countless things that have happened in 90 days.
And there's a lot of folding happening. I mean, these law firms folded faster than a bag of chips. I mean, it's nobody is really, except for now we're seeing what happens with Harvard and some of the courts. There's not a lot of resistance happening here. Much more to discuss ahead. Coming up next, Senator Chris Van Hollen meets face-to-face with Kilmar Abrego Garcia in El Salvador. What the right has to say about the latest move in the pitched battle over immigration and a wrongfully deported man. And outrage after RFK Jr. once again delivers a stunning claim about autism fueled by misinformation.